join me as we're cycling EuroVelo 1 from Leenane to Clifden. This is the route we're going to be taking today. Now, I'm setting out from Leenane. It's actually quite late in the evening, and I stopped for a pint before I set out on the last bit of my trip that day to reach a beach where I was going to be camping. I'm going down Killary fjord, or Killary Harbour as it's called, an 11-kilometre long fjord carved by a glacier 20,000 years ago. And one of the other things you might try here if you want gravel riding is this Western Way turn-off. I have no idea how far you can get on it on a bike, but I pointed it out yesterday as well. So the other thing I pointed out incorrectly in yesterday's video in one of the labels was a mountain I had mislabeled that was actually Devil's Mother Mountain. Now, it's reasonable for me to mislabel that because Devil's Mother Mountain is a bit mysterious. There's a fantastic author called Tim Robinson who wrote basically a love story trilogy to Connemara, but one of the bits he opens one of the books with is the existence of that mountain, or rather what it was actually called. He reports that people in Leenane or in the local area didn't refer to Devil's Mother as a mountain there at all, but a few years later when he was back with a TV crew, one of the locals who had a very deep folklore knowledge of the place reveals that the mountain, or the ridge with two bumps on it to the Galway side of Killary, was in fact called the Devil's Balls in Irish, but that name had become lost, or at least the Ordnance Survey hadn't used it. Anyway, if you want really good stories about Connemara, and it's really hard to describe what Robinson actually does in his books. It's a mixture of history, geology, culture, observations. He walked the entire coastline, in fact. He's an excellent place to start for that sort of material. If you're going to be cycling in the area, you'd be really well rewarded by actually reading those before you go. They're quite extraordinary books. So here I'm heading down towards sunset. I'm going to spend the night on Glassilluan beach, and then I'm going to set off again in the morning. But I presented this as a single segment because I think people are more likely to be looking for how to get from Leenane to Clifden. So 70 kilometres later, climbing over a couple of passes. Wasn't sure I was going to make it, but I did. And I have no regrets. No regrets at all. Look at this. This is amazing. And here's a view of the beach the following morning. So Glassilluan Beach is a very short diversion from the EuroVelo 1 route. It's only about a kilometre from where off the road that branches down to the beach. We're now back on EuroVelo 1 and heading along the official route. It wiggles in and out quite a lot, particularly if you compare it with the national road. In comparison, there's an official campsite here, by the way. That does take cyclists, and I think currently in 2005 it's €25 a night, so that might be an option for you. I would recommend, though, if you're cycling this, you probably contact them and check if they've a curfew. An issue I have commonly found with campsites is that they only allow people in up to say 5 or 6 in the evening, which is probably reasonable for lots of categories, but isn't really very reasonable for cyclists because very often you arrive late. Now, I found that with official campsites that do have a curfew, often if you ring them and say, look, I'm cycling, is it okay if I arrive late? They'll say, grand, put your tent up and then we'll catch you in the morning or whatever. So it normally isn't an issue, but it is the sort of thing I would check in advance so you're not caught out. As you get to Tully Cross, there's a pub there on the right that I have previously stopped in and got a midday lunch, a fish chowder I think it was, and a pint of Guinness. It was excellent. So that might be a useful stop-off point if you hit it while you're hungry. I think there's also a shop in that village. So the bridge here has a bit of a tragic story with it. That's the old bridge. And behind it, there's a big old house castle that was built by a rich couple who had honeymooned here, had liked it so much they decided to build a big house, raised a family of 9. The wife tragically died, and then there was an accident on that bridge where I think a horse bolted, and the coach the daughter was in was upset, and she was thrown from the bridge into the river where she drowned. So that's a kind of typical Connemara story in a couple of ways, but one of which is that Connemara kind of became a bit of a playground for the wealthy. particularly English wealthy people who bought big estates here for the trout fishing and the salmon fishing. So I stopped here for lunch, which was basically a breakfast roll and a coffee, probably more a late breakfast than a lunch before heading on. But the actual population of Connemara otherwise were incredibly poor. The land around here is not good at all. You can sort of tell that from the footage you're seeing. And there was quite a high population. So for particularly in famine times, Connemara was absolutely devastated by the famine. And there was a thing called the Congested District Board. After that built lots and lots of the little harbour piers you will see as you're going around the coastline. And that was so people would have better access to fishing in future in particular. It was also the site, though, of an awful lot of very major land struggles. There's a Facebook page called The History of Connemara, I think, that has done a fantastic job of documenting what many of those were. And often the story of those land struggles would be that sort of rich English couple coming in, buying a big estate with tenants on it, and then the tenants being very unhappy about the way they're actually treated, organising against them, and then conducting acts of sabotage that often involved cattle maiming, for instance, but also boycotts where everybody would agree not to talk or provide services or to sell items to the landlords. And that period in Irish history is known as the Land War. It's kind of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, which saw huge upheaval in the country and which, in fact, forced Britain to bring in this set of land acts where they bought the estates, the tenants were loaned the money to pay for them, and that money was then paid back over many years. So the reason that the ownership of land is extremely different in Ireland than it is in Britain, and particularly in Scotland. Scotland's very much still owned by these big estates, is because of that land struggle. That meant that by the time of the War of Independence, although there were lots of big houses burnt during that war, there was maybe 200 big houses burnt out, but the actual land those houses owned had already largely been taken and redistributed. And in areas where it wasn't, in fact, a very common thing that happened during the Land War was that landless labourers would seize the land and seek to divide it up amongst them. Now, there's a whole big, long history of that. I've written, in fact, in great detail about that in almost a former life, but if you Google Andrew Flood, Land War and War of Independence or any of those terms, you'll find some very long essays that are looking at that period of struggle in great detail and how it shaped the Ireland we live in today. And very much that means that, we just don't have those big estates and all the problems that go with them that you find in Scotland. We're approaching the access to Omey Island here. So this island is very close to the shoreline, and basically at low tide it's possible to just walk or drive out across to it. It's quite a popular destination, and there's a bar there called Sweeney's Strand Bar, if I remember correctly, where I stopped on this particular day, glorious sunshine actually, and got a fish chowder and pint of Guinness. Fish chowder tends to be a very big staple of pubs on the west coast, and in particular if you're fed up eating fish and chips, or burger and chips is often a good alternate option. So we're now coming down towards the Clifden Sky Road, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we get it, but today's trip's going to end in Clifden. So as I was saying earlier, if you go and have a look at the map, you'll see if you were to cycle the main road, that's the N59 from Leenane to Clifden, it's actually quite a short trip, but the EuroVelo one route, in contrast, takes this very, very convoluted route where it's mostly hugging the coastline. And I think you can see why it takes that route. It's really quite attractive. It's great cycling. And mostly not so much traffic. The traffic is picking up here now because we're heading back towards the N59 as we're going down the side of Streamstown Bay, and in fact at the bottom of Streamstown Bay there's about a 200 metre section or 300 metre section of the N59 you're on before you turn across it and then come back up the other side. Anyway, continuing the story of landlordism in Ireland, Clifton's actually quite interesting because it's not that old a town at all. It was started, the construction of it was started in 1812, which possibly, if you're American, seems very old, but most Irish towns would go back to, 14th century or earlier. And basically, it was a project of a landlord, John D'Arcy, there's a D apostrophe RC, whose family had been given land in Connemara during the Cromwellian conquest, so that's when people were told to go to hell or Connaught, and also apparently parts of Connaught were given away. But he had decided that the region needed a town to act as a hub and a marketplace, so he picked the site at Clifden and started construction there in 1812. It's unusual for towns, particularly on the west coast, in that it's planned, it's laid out as an actual grid. It started off with a marketplace and all that built into it. Most other towns, they developed organically from small places to bigger places over town, and he called it Clifden because in Irish, basically, that's stepping stones, and it's probably because that river, which can be a raging torrent, I've seen it, if it rained recently, it's well worth having a look at the river, it can be huge, but there was stepping stones crossing the river at that particular point. So he's known as a bit of an improving landlord. I don't know how true that is or isn't. I think it's often the case that landlords in Ireland were so terrible that any landlord that did anything was just got a reputation as being better. But maybe there's more history than that in his particular case. So we are now on what's called the Sky Road. So this is I think it's a 16-kilometre loop from Clifden that is a popular cycling route for if you want to do a day cycle, although as you can see here, the hills are pretty steep. And it's called the Sky Road because it has some absolutely fantastic views, particularly here at this viewing point where you're looking out. And if you get a clear day like I did, you can see the Aran Islands. You can see, you're seeing a long way south into Connemara. You can see the 12 Bends in the other direction. It's basically just one collection of fantastic views after another. Now, because it's quite a popular tourist route, as you can see, even today, and this is May that I'm cycling this, it's mid-May, before the tourist season has really picked up, there's already quite a lot of traffic on the road, and I suspect in July and August it might become quite unpleasant. However, maybe it's grand and they're all careful and driving slowly because they're looking at the scenery. It's also got this fantastic view down into the town of Clifden itself with the 12 Bends in the background. Clifden has loads of pubs and restaurants and indeed hotels and other accommodation in it. It's a real tourism hub for this region. So this is the end of this segment of the cycle. The next segment is going to be from Clifden to Casla. Do give the channel a follow and do give this particular video a like so it gets out to more people. If you want to follow my cycling live as I do it, give me a follow on Instagram. I'm also eBike Touring Life, and basically if you have a look there, you'll see I post pictures and videos live from the road as I'm doing it. And the last thing, as I'm always telling people, is do read the video description and read the comments as well. You'll find people often post more accurate information to the comments, corrections, and if you look at the previous video in this sequence, you'll see that that's where somebody informed me that the mountains I'd incorrectly identified was in fact the Devil's Mother Mountain, which is quite useful. But that's behind Leenane, by the way, if you're trying to work out where it is yourself and trying to also find out where the Devil's Balls Mountain is.